Hello class, and welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to be talking about learning styles, or what you might have heard as multiple intelligences, as we're going to discuss in this course. Now you've probably heard that individuals all learn differently, that we all have our own special way of learning and we gravitate towards one learning style versus another. The common learning styles that you usually hear about would be, do you learn better by hearing or by reading? Or maybe you learn better by watching a video. Other theories are that we learn better by doing as opposed to reading or hearing. Those are often known as kinesthetic learners. But however we learn, as an educator, it's important for us to understand how other people learn as well. Because when you're in a class or a clinical setting with either students or patients, you're going to have to adjust how you teach to your students so that you can best match their learning preferences in order so that they can meet the outcomes that you've set out for them to achieve. That's going to make them successful, and then that's going to make you a successful educator. So let's look at this idea of learning styles or multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner is a pretty famous education researcher, and he's proposed multiple intelligences. Now, there's been a lot of confusion and even pushback over multiple intelligences over the years. And so as you read through the documents that I've prepared for you in this course, you'll be able to get an idea about the tension that exists within the education community about these multiple intelligences. But really, all they are different ways to describe how we learn. Some people like to call that a learning style. Other people, including Gardner himself, says we should get rid of learning styles, the name altogether. But no matter what we call it, these ideas help us to describe or categorize how people learn and that they learn differently and what they gravitate towards in their learning. So Gardner presented these multiple intelligences. These multiple intelligences that he put forward include the styles, if you want to call them that, of the visual or spatial arena. And this is basically those students that learn best by seeing something like directions, maps, or charts. These types of learners are very visual, and that really helps them. The next would be linguistic or verbal learners. These learners really gravitate towards reading and gaining meaning from different writings or people speaking. The next intelligence or style would be the interpersonal or relational category. And this is basically an interactive type of learning where you learn best when you're with other groups, either another student, one or two small groups, to where you're actually bouncing ideas off of each other or using each other in order to correct each other's learning or misconceptions, sort of an iron sharpening iron concept there, where you're helping one another learn in a smaller community. The next in our list is the intrapersonal. Now this is different than interpersonal, where interpersonal, of course, is learning in relation to others. Intrapersonal is meaning you basically learn best alone. So you sitting at home with a cup of coffee and your notebook and your textbook or your computer, that's really where you thrive, and that's where you gain your best understanding. That's how you're going to learn best. You're often distracted by the small groups or study groups. You feel like you really don't accomplish anything. It's just not for you. You want to dive into things quietly with no distractions, just you and your material. The next category is logical or mathematical. These students learn best using reasoning skills, logic types of skills, mathematical skills. So a lot of times you would think about, okay, well, this is your math teacher or your engineer type of student, to where they really think about the world in a mathematical way. The next category is musical. With musical learners, this doesn't mean that you have to play music in order for them to learn, but it categorizes their learning into regular patterns or rhythms, which is pretty typical in music. And these patterns and consistent rhythms help that student categorize or organize their learning into a framework which is going to help them retain it better. The next category, which we mentioned is a pretty common one, is that kinesthetic or active learning style. And in this class, we're going to talk a lot about active learning and active learning techniques, things you can do within the classroom or the clinic with your patients or your students in order to help them not just learn the material, but to actually get up and do the material, to actually put that into practice, what we've been teaching them. These learners typically do best when they can get out of their seats and accomplish something or achieve something. They're often motion orientated or rely a lot on physical coordination when it comes to applying their learning. And then the last category is one that Gardner added a little bit after he originally introduced the intelligences to the educational community. And it includes a naturalistic learning style, which is more in touch with nature or being in tune to the environment around them and using the actual physical space that you're in while you're learning in order to help your learning. And it is important to think, okay, this isn't like the environment necessarily that we think about, trees, birds, bees, flowers, things like that. But what's the learning environment that you're actually in? Now, this does include nature, but think about the classroom as well. Don't just limit it to, the thinking of nature, but what are the physical and mental aspects of the learning environment that the student is actually in, and how does that affect their ability to learn? Okay, so let's just quickly review those 8 multiple intelligence that we've listed here so far. Remember, you've got the visual or spatial learner, linguistic or verbal, interpersonal, which is learning with others, and then intrapersonal, which is learning best on your own, the logical or mathematical style, the musical style, the kinesthetic or bodily style, and then the naturalistic style. So I mentioned that there's often in academics a little bit of controversy over these multiple intelligence. And Gardner himself is going to address this issue. He's known to say that the multiple intelligences have actually become what they intended to replace. Meaning that as educators, we sort of get cookie cuttered into, we're going to teach to a certain style of learner, or I myself am a certain style of learner, and so that's how I'm going to teach. And what Gardner was trying to do with presenting these multiple intelligences through his research was to get away from that one-size-fits-all type of teaching and type of learning. And what's actually happened within academics and education is that we've now taken each of these individual styles, if you will, and we've tried to sort of force people into these boxes, including the teachers themselves. And then we say, okay, if you're this type of learner, you need to teach in this type of way. And if you identify that you have students that are this type of learner or multiple intelligence, then you need to be teaching to that very specific student in this very specific way. And Gardner said that's not what this was intended to do. Gardner wanted to replace the narrow pigeonholing of how somebody learns and therefore teaches as an educator as well. What he wanted to do was provide a framework of learning and teaching, not to provide specific learning styles, but rather to acknowledge that we all have multiple learning styles. In fact, his premise was not that each of us are one of these 8 styles, but in fact, we probably all have a combination of these 8 learning styles within us, but we do gravitate towards one in a majority way. Yet that doesn't mean we don't ever learn with these other methods. In fact, we do. And that's what he was trying to complement and say, we need to get away from just trying to teach to one individual style and hit them from multiple angles. Now, that being said, it is possible to isolate your strength of learning style. And it's important when you identify that, which you will have done this week, because that's going to help you understand some of the actual practices you can put into place in order to be a more efficient learner and therefore a better educator as well. Now, what we're not saying here is that people don't learn differently or distinctly from each other. They do. You can identify that within yourself, comparing other family members or maybe classmates or other people that you work with, especially in age development. It's pretty obvious that as children, we learn differently than we do as adults. If you have children, you know this pretty clearly just from observing them. But even if you don't, you probably have nieces or nephews or know friends with children, or yourself was once a child, and you can appreciate the difference between the learning that took place as a youth compared to your learning now as an adult. Now, besides Gardner, in education, you're probably going to read literature about Sternberg. And Sternberg is a seminal researcher in the theory of education. You cannot have a degree in education without learning about both Gardner or Sternberg. Sternberg approaches this a little bit from a broader angle, and he uses a tripartite or triarchic theory, emphasizing 3 abilities for intelligences, if you will, instead of the 8 that Gardner provides. So obviously Gardner's are going to be drilled down a little bit more specific. And I just mentioned this in passing a little bit, just so that you have that broad understanding of what the literature is saying. But Sternberg tells us that you basically have an analytical student, a creative student, and a practical student. So the analytical would relate like to Gardner's multiple intelligence of those that are mathematical, logical, that read and listen in order to learn. The creative students that Sternberg categorizes would be your musical or artsy type of students. And then you've got your practical students that would be more environmental, more kinesthetic, things that make sense to them as sort of common sense learning. And so what you really see is Sternberg and Gardner essentially are sort of saying the same thing in different ways at different levels of specificity. But nonetheless, this is something that you will see in education. And I bring this up because just because I'm presenting to you Gardner's multiple intelligences and we talked about learning styles, that doesn't mean that there's not other theories or ideas out there regarding how people learn. It's just a matter of picking a few that broadly represent the full counsel of the literature that's available to us as academics, and for you as a beginning educator. Now, with all this said, and talking about the literature that exists in academia about learning styles, there really is a void in the literature documenting the benefit to teaching to learning styles. So understand that this is kind of a theoretical framework for us to understand how we learn and sometimes how to best teach, but that we make a big mistake if we focus in and say, this is a kinesthetic learner, they need to be active, so I need to teach in an active way with all sorts of activities, which oftentimes just end up being distractions for other types of students. The literature does not present to us tangible evidence that teaching to individual learning styles is beneficial. I'm not saying that we avoid it, but we're just not seeing it realized when we do research on the topic that that is the best way to teach. And that supports what Gardner was saying in the first place. Don't pigeonhole your teaching or your learning into one style. You should be adapting it, hitting it from multiple angles, or multiple intelligences. So how can we practically apply this knowledge to focus on either how we best learn or our students best learn, as well as how we're going to teach? Well, just a few do's and don'ts. We should be providing multiple types and ways of delivering and assessing the material to our learners. They should have multiple ways to consume content. Oftentimes when I'm teaching, I'll use a lot of analogies, and I'll give I might deliver the content straight away. And I might see that half of the class is nodding their head and following along, and the other class is just sort of glazed over, eyes are just out there somewhere else, and they're not getting it. I can clearly see this. So then maybe I tell a story or provide an analogy of what I'm explaining in order to help that student sort of visualize in their mind what I'm talking about. So already we've got one student that just audibly heard it and they were good. Another student read the textbook beforehand and they're fine. But the other student needed to actually see it in their mind's eye, what was happening. Now you might have another student where you have to demonstrate it. You need to get the equipment out and show them. And then you might have a kinesthetic learner where they don't actually get what you're talking about until you have them do it, where you have them apply the material and actively get out of their chair and demonstrate to you that they understand what you're talking about. So in all of this, as educators, we have multiple ways to do this. Of course, we can lecture, we can provide the textbooks, audio, videos. They can do some type of artwork or assignment that's a project-based assessment. We also talked about activity or demonstration and so on with the list of ways that we can teach to. So think about each of these things as waves crashing on a beach. Right? The first wave gets it gets your feet and your ankles wet. And then the next wave is a little bit bigger, and it goes up to maybe your shins or your knees. And then all of a sudden a big crasher comes in and hits you up by the chest, right? That first wave doesn't get you completely wet. It takes wave after wave in order to actually, fully soak you. Knowledge is the same way. You're not going to pick it up the first time every time. And so you need to be hit sometimes with multiple waves of different sizes and consistencies before all of it actually sinks in, before you're, wet per se, knowledge-wise. Remember that rarely does a one-size-fits-all approach ever work. Just like teaching one specific learning style to your entire class isn't going to work. That one size isn't going to fit all for your entire class. So you need to be creative, and you need to teach to multiple learning styles in your lessons. If we think about this lesson right now, look at the materials that I provided you. They're written. Okay, you can read them and see them. You have discussion boards throughout the week. So you're doing interpersonal work as well as intrapersonal on your own time. You're hearing and seeing me present the lesson as well in the video. And then I'm going to have you actually do an activity in turning in an assignment. So I'm hitting multiple routes of learning all in this 1 week lesson. So that's sort of a practical application or demonstration of teaching to multiple intelligences. I'd like to emphasize one more point about teaching and learning and with multiple intelligences. And that's the difference between teaching something and training someone. So we want to be able to train our learners and not just teach them. So what's the difference between teaching and training? Well, teaching is the listening or reading of the content. So you're consuming it by either me lecturing to you or you reading it. And that's really good because that's the foundation of our learning, which we're going to talk about in the next lesson on Bloom's taxonomy. But we fail as educators if we only give content to our learners and then don't actually help them to apply using it. And that's where we go from teaching and we move over into the training category. So teaching is delivering the material, and then training is actually having our learners apply the material. It's important to do both. We need to teach them, that's the foundation. And then as we move up through our Bloom's taxonomy, we'll learn about that next, they're going to start applying it in different ways, and that is the training. So always think, teach and train. Don't stop at teaching alone. You've got to train them up. And now just really quickly, as we finish off this lesson on learning styles or multiple intelligences, I'd like to also remind you of some things definitely not to do. And we've already covered these a little bit, so I'm not going to spend much time here, but be careful that you don't label or stigmatize certain learners into their one style. Now, you took the learning style survey and you probably got a pretty good idea of how you best learn. And that's important. You should emphasize that, but you should not make that the only way you learn. Remember, you need wave after wave of learning in order to get that comprehensive understanding. And that's, as educators, what we're looking for. So be careful that you don't fall into just one learning style as you prepare to teach. The other thing goes back to the research related to not really showing empirical results from teaching to the learning styles. So do not painstakingly adapt all of your content to match the learner style. So it's nice that I had you guys take that learning style quiz, and that's something I've done with students for a decade. The thing is, though, I'm going to look at that, but I'm not going to craft all of my material based off of those results. That's there to help you understand what are some of the tools that you can best seek out to consume the content and therefore learn it better. I'm going to take that multiple approach, wave after wave, in order to, fully soak you guys and all of my learners in the content that I'm providing. I'm not going to craft each lesson according to those results. Now, there is a caveat to that. Now, perhaps you're in the clinical setting and you're one-on-one with a student, or maybe it's a patient, okay? You're a COPD educator, asthma educator, you name it, all right? And you're one-on-one. Now, at that point, you might start to pick up what is their learning style. You might be able to identify some things they gravitate towards. So in that case, adapt your teaching according to how they learn best. As you continue to grow as an educator, you'll be able to spend time with each learner and quickly understand what style they're picking up from and early adapt your presentation skills in order to best suit that individual learner. But remember, that's with individual learners, not with a group of learners or an entire class. Okay, class, that's the lesson on multiple intelligences and learning styles. I hope that benefits you in understanding not only how you learn, but then how you're going to start crafting yourself as an educator to teach others better. All right, thanks, class. I'll see you in the next lesson.